This is Alex from the Sewing Workshop, and we are so excited to be part of E.E. Shank's Fall Trends. You're about to watch the Maison Top online workshop, which is part of our Sewing Workshop Sew Confident program. Our Sew Confident program is the Sewing Workshop's signature membership program, where every month we release new projects to our monthly or yearly subscribers. We provide access to Q&As, a private social media community, a coveted discount, and monthly kit releases. In this workshop, you're going to learn tons on how to work with knit fabrics. And as you can see, I love this project. I'm wearing it right now. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you love this Sewing Workshop Sew Confident project.
Welcome to our brand new Sew Confident Series 10. I'm so happy that you can join me as we make a garment a month. For our first project, we will be making the Maison Top. We're going to start with a simple design to get used to the concept of these classes and the whole process. I will be taking you through the steps to make the top and highlighting the important points that will help you sew better and more confidently. So let's look at the top. I like the fact that this top is really simple. It's a great project to start at the very beginning of our whole year. It has a really nice ready-to-wear binding, and I'm going to teach you how to make this perfectly. It's 3/4 of an inch wide rather than our normal 1/2 inch wide, so there's a little trick to it. It has a nice full sleeve that ends at about the elbow. It's meant to blouse, and it gathers a little bit, just more like easing into a bottom band. So here's what you're going to learn in the class. You're going to learn how to sew jersey that curls, how to match stripes at side seams. I'm going to show you several seam and hem finish options. You're going to learn how to install professional looking neck bindings, and I'm going to share all kinds of tips and techniques for achieving the most professional look. So now let's take a look at the materials that you'll need. We're going to be using some cotton jersey knit for this class. And the way you identify jersey is it has lengthwise ribs on the face of it and horizontal little rows on the back side. It's much like knit and purl in knitting. Sometimes it's very difficult to really see that, but if you look closely, you can see the difference in the texture between the right side and the wrong side. But the most identifying feature of jersey is that it curls to the right side when you stretch it on the cross grain. And it does curl to the wrong side when you stretch it on the vertical grain. But I'm usually more concerned about the crosswise grain. So be sure to stretch it, and then you'll know for sure which side to use as the right side of your fabric. Then there are a lot of other tools you'll want as well. The first thing is polyester thread. We use polyester rather than cotton thread because we want the little bit of give that the polyester thread has. I use a 75/11 universal needle. Now that's just because my machine really prefers that kind of needle. But if you have trouble, if you get skip stitches or other issues that happen while you're sewing, then you may want to change to a different needle. But for me, it's universal 75s. My go-to glue that I use is Fusy Web. It's a paper-covered line of glue, and I'm going to demonstrate how to use this, and you'll never sew without it again. I like to use glass head pins that are very sharp, and I can get my iron near the head of them and the head won't melt. I'm really loving these Karen K. Buckley scissors these days for cutting and trimming, and you'll see that I'll use them throughout the class. I don't have the needle here that we're going to be using, but we will want a large eye needle, and you'll see that later in a lesson. A chalkener, some kind of chalk marker that lays down a very fine line of chalk. A see-through ruler, some kind of a cutting straight edge or an edge that you can draw next to. Also, a little bit of tag board or a manila file folder that's cut into a 1 inch wide strip. This is a walking foot, If you have an even feed feature on your sewing machine, you'll certainly want to engage it. But if you don't, it's a great investment to go ahead and buy that extra accessory called a walking foot. Some sewing machines have a wide throat plate opening, particularly if you have a machine that also embroiders. So I've invested in a separate little 5mm throat plate. It's not a single hole throat plate, that's another option, but it's just obviously narrower than the 9mm of embroidery machines, and that'll help the fabric from becoming sucked down into the throat plate. You'll want a little scrap of tissue paper, you'll want a tailor's ham, and a sleeve board. So I think that does it for your tools. And now we're going to talk about some prep. Hopefully you have had time to do some prep work for this class. All of the information about this class is in your account on our website. The pattern is there for you to download. The preparation information is there. The amount of fabric that you need for your size, all of it is there. So you'll want to keep routinely checking back into your account on our website for further information. You've downloaded your pattern, and now you've determined your size by, of course, measuring your full bust and choosing your pattern size by using that measurement. And you can always measure the actual tissue pattern or paper pattern, however you have downloaded it, and maybe copied it off, maybe not, but you can measure the full bust measurement and you'll know how much ease is built into the pattern. And then you can decide whether to make the size that maybe is a size smaller or the size that's exactly to your bust measurement, but whatever, you have determined your size and you've cut that out. You've washed your fabric, you've dried your fabric, perhaps you've put a little 4-inch square of fabric in your washing machine and you've tested to see how much is going to be shrinking. If not, you've thrown the whole yardage into the washing machine and you've just gone for it. That's fine too, but your fabric is ready and you're ready to cut out. So now you're going to cut out single layer. I'm sorry to tell you that, but it's true. It's so much easier to get a better straight of grain when you cut pieces out single layer. So you might want to make a full pattern piece. Let's say a front is meant to be cut on the fold and you want to flip the pattern, you can do that, or you can add paper and make a full pattern. Finding the straight of grain is really tricky. I just sometimes have to get a magnifying glass and determine those lengthwise ribs, and then I take a ruler and a chalkener and I will mark a few of the ribs throughout the yardage so that I have a reference point from which I can measure the straight of grain. Every pattern piece should be on a nap layout, meaning that they go the same direction. Don't be turning them or flipping them. And now you want to mark everything before the pieces leave the table. Whenever there's a notch at an edge, you want to clip into those notches. If it's a single notch, you clip once. If it's a double notch, you clip twice. And then I think that the best way to mark a dot is to actually use a tailor's tack. I use silk thread or cotton thread, doesn't really matter, in this particular case on a knit, and a nice sharp needle, and I make a single stitch, and then I make another stitch and leave a soft loop, cut that off, and that is my tailor tack. Now we're going to be starting to sew. Let's go to lesson 2. There are 2 seam finishes that I recommend for sewing jersey knits. The first is to simply use your polyester thread and a regular stitch length of about 2.4 to 2.5 millimeter in length and sew on the seam line, just a straight stitch. And then using your isocord serging thread or another kind of whatever you have for a serger thread really, set it up for 3-thread formation, and then you will serge the 2 raw edges together, just taking off a little bit of the edge and leaving about 3/8 to a 1/2 inch of a finished seam. And then that seam will get pressed in one direction. If you don't have a serger or an overlock machine, as it's really called, then you will want to, again, stitch on the stitching line and then stitch about 1/4 inch away from that, again a straight stitch, and trim really close to that second row of stitching, and that is simply your seam. That will keep the edges from curling and the seam will really lie flat. So next we're going to learn how to match some stripes. The first thing you want to do when you're matching stripes is you want to identify the seam allowance line on the right side of the fabric. So I've drawn a red line here with magic marker, which is of course not what you're going to use. You're going to use some chalk, but I wanted you to be able to see it. So the red line is on the 5/8 inch seam allowance line, and then I have fused down a strip of your fusee web. And you can see that's paper covered, and I've placed it right next to this red line. I'm going to pull the paper off. And you can see that there's a little bit of a tacky surface right there, a little bit of a web glue. Now with right sides together, I'm going to line up the raw edges of the corresponding piece, and I'm going to start by placing a pin at the edge of one stripe right into the corresponding stripe. And if I keep my pins flat or angled in some way, then I'm going to be able to press over them. So however many pins you put in kind of determines how well you get this matched. And I generally use pins on the entire seam, but you can see that I'm matched up on a few of those stripes. So all I have to do now is get my steam iron out, and I can press over those pins, and I have fused the edges together. Take out my pins, and you can see that those stripes are lined up perfectly so that when I sew my seam on my Maison top, everything is perfectly lined up on the side seam. Now we're going to take a look at some hem finishes. Believe it or not, the very first thing you do after you've cut out your pieces is to prepare your hems. You're certainly not going to sew them, but you're going to get them to the step where you will be able to easily sew them at the end. But it's easier to deal with this process now while each piece is flat. We already know that our fabric is curling on the crosswise, so sometimes in order to actually have the wrong side of the fabric up and deal with the raw edge, I will drag it along the pressing surface so that I can get that raw edge absolutely flat. And then I take a strip of fusee web and I'm going to lay that right on the raw edge. And that controls the curl from now on. And I just tear it off. This is going to be for the sleeve pieces. So after you have applied the fusee web, then you want to take your 1-inch template that you've cut really precisely with a rotary cutter. And I always like to mark mine just to make sure that I keep track of the dimension of all of my templates in my assortment. And you're going to put this on the right side, the wrong side of the fabric. And you're going to place it about 1 inch from the edge, but I'm going to put the raw edge now up and over the template. And I'm going to press through all of the layers. And I'm just going to keep marching along here, making sure that the raw edge is matching the top of that template. Now I have a memory crease that will come in handy when everything is sewn together, the side seams are sewn together, the sleeve seams are sewn together, and I can actually not have to find my 1-inch hem. It's there and ready for me. I'm recommending 3 different finishes for your hems. The first is simply a straight stitch. Nothing more than that. Because knit doesn't ravel, you could leave the edges raw, or you could use your 3-thread serge finish to finish that edge first, and then fuse your hem in place, and then top stitch with a straight stitch. Or you could use a nice zigzag stitch. I actually think that a zigzag stitch is a very attractive stitch, and nothing wrong with using that. It gives you a little bit of give if you need that on a particular style of top. And the third one is to use a cover stitch. And that, of course, is a separate feature or a separate machine. Chain stitch, cover stitch, that's all a different threading system. And so if you don't have that ability, you either don't own the machine or your machine doesn't convert to that, then you might want to use the straight stitch or the zigzag. But the cover stitch is the most professional that you can use because it not only looks great with its 2 threads on the surface and its connecting stitches on the wrong side, that also covers the raw edge on the wrong side, so it looks fantastic. And it's what I use mostly because I happen to have the machine. But not everybody does, and the other ones are good options for you as well. The very first thing you do in constructing the Maison top is to sew your shoulder seams, which I've already done, both the left side and the right side. And now it's time to learn how to press those seams just perfectly. The seam needs to go towards the back, one direction, and you do that from the right side of the fabric. I'm placing this over a tailor's ham so that I can build in and keep the curve. If you notice when you cut out, that garment has a curved seam. So I'm not letting the iron touch the fabric because knits have a shine to them, believe it or not, if you overpress them. So you want to be careful when you press knits. And so either lightly touch the fabric with the iron or steam it and press with your ham. And that will get you the perfect pressing on seams. So now I'm going to show you how to make the best neck binding you've ever made. Now we're going to learn how to put on the perfect neck binding. The neck binding pieces that we produce here at the Sewing Workshop are based on a certain ratio. And that ratio is 7/8, meaning that the neck binding is smaller than the circumference of the neck opening. You can see from the chart that there are 2 ways to calculate that 7/8 ratio. I'm using 24 inches as an example of the circumference of the neck opening. So that's the first thing you will do, is measure that and then choose which method of math you want to do to come up with your 7/8 ratio. You can see in the graphic that I'm using an example of a neck binding that is 24 inches long. And there are 2 or 3 different ways to calculate that ratio. Our neck binding is correct for this pattern, but if you're using a different pattern, you might need to calculate your own neck binding length. So let's start with how you deal with these neck bindings, these pieces of fabric that curl and are so unruly sometimes to work with. So again, I have drug the piece on the ironing surface to flatten the curl, and I'm using some fusee web on the very edge, but in this case I don't need the complete width of the fusee web. I've actually cut it in half. You just need a little bit, and I've already fused it to one long edge, and notice that I've kept it out of the ends where I'm going to be sewing the seam. But I do want to fuse the 2 raw edges together, so I'm going to remove the fusee web and start pressing these edges together. So I can get these finger pressed just a little bit and then fuse those edges. And notice I'm not fusing or pressing the fold at this point, just those raw edges. I like to keep the neck binding a little bit soft for a while until I actually have it on the garment. But what this does is this really helps you control that curl of a jersey, and you're not fighting this as you're applying this neck binding to the neck opening. So now you have a flat, nice piece to work with. Before we actually do any sewing on this neck binding, we want to do some marking. A stitching line is important to identify. So I have my see-through ruler, and I'm going to place it 3/4 of an inch from the fold, and that's important. From the fold, not from the raw edge. It's much more important to keep a distance that's the same from the fold, and we don't care so much about the seam allowance width. So just mark with your chalk the entire length, 3/4 of an inch. The next step is to sew the ends of this binding together. And you remember that I kept the fusee web out of the end so that I can get to that. And I've already pinned them together so my raw edges are even. And then this is where I find that a little scrap of tissue paper really comes in handy, because sometimes when you start sewing on the very edge of these knits, they can get hung up and they can get really tricky to start with lots of threads down into your throat plate, and you have to dig them out, and oh, it's such a mess. So the paper stabilizer is really handy in this particular condition. And the paper comes right off. We just tear it off. Really easy. You can use leftover tissue paper from your patterns. This is pattern paper. Doesn't really matter what you use. Just something kind of sheer that tears easily. So now I want to trim this seam. And you might want to press this open. Sometimes you can do it with your fingers. And if you want to go to the ironing board, that's fine too. But now you can complete the folding of your binding. Now we're going to quarter mark this, and also the garment as well. I'm starting with my neck binding when I'm quarter marking. So I have folded it with the seam allowance at one end. And there's a fold at the other end. And I'm just going to put a little clip right there through the seam allowances. Then I put that new clip on top of the seam so that I have two new end folds. And I'm going to clip those end folds. So now I have divided my neck binding in fourths. I want to do the same thing to the garment. I have the seam allowances of the shoulders that I can stack on top of one another so that I can find my center front and center back. Now sometimes I actually mark these when I'm cutting out, but if I forget, then this is how you do it. Just make sure that your edges are lined up so that you can get the right proportion. There's the center front. And now to get the last two, you want to line up the center front and the center back clips. Line up those raw edges. And now we're going to put a little clip right here. And notice that it's not at the shoulder seam. It's just a little distance from the shoulder seam. That's the way it's supposed to be. It's rare that it is the shoulder seam because necklines are just not even in the front and the back. So when you divide them, they're going to be a little bit different. So now I'm ready to pin the neck binding onto the neck opening. And obviously the seam goes to the center back. The opposite clip from the seam is the center front. I'm only going to use 4 pins. One at the center front, Move this around so that I line up the ones near the shoulder seam. Center back. I'm right sides together, right side of the binding to the right side of the garment. I've made that mistake a few times. And one last pin. That's all you need for this process. So now I'm ready to go to the sewing machine and sew it. I put it into the sewing machine so that the entire circle of the neckline is on top of the whole surface of the sewing machine. I'm going to start at the center back at the seam, and this is where my chalk marks come in handy because I want to sew on those previous chalk marks. So I just take a couple of stitches to get started, and needle down position is essential. Notice I don't sew over pins ever. I'm going to grab the next pin with my right hand, and my left hand holds the neck binding, and that's what guides it to keep it lined up so that all the raw edges are together. I like the needle down position so that I can lift the presser foot and readjust a little bit if I need to. But my left hand is in control of where that's placed with the raw edges. I'm giving it a little bit of a tug with my right hand and placement with my left hand. I'm coming to the shoulder seam, and since I started in the back, I want to make sure that that seam allowance is to the back. So usually I have to readjust that. Now I'm at the first shoulder seam. Let's do one more section, and then I'll show you what it looks like finished. So I'm grabbing the next pin with my left hand, the neck binding with my left hand, right hand on the pin, left hand on the binding. And I'm going to continue to sew. Take out my pin, readjust. Sometimes you have to take a breath and just readjust. So I'm trying to give it the same tension in pulling the neck binding. Remember, the neck binding is smaller than the neck opening, so you have to stretch it. So I would continue to do this for the next 2 quarters. And now I'll show you what it looks like after I've sewn it. I've sewn the last 2 quarters completely with my straight stitch, and now I've shifted to my serger or overlock so that I can 3-thread serge the seam. And you notice how narrow I get this. It's about 3/8, maybe a fat quarter, but this is an important something to note, that I don't leave this seam allowance very wide. Otherwise, your neck binding will tend to sort of flip out. So once you've sewn everything completely in the round, then you want to serge finish your seam as well. Now I'm going to show you how to finish this off. So you notice there's a tail that I've left, and I leave it pretty long because I want to feed that through a needle that has a large eye. And the larger the better, in my opinion. So I'm feeding that through the big eye. And then I want to take the tip of the needle and simply slip that under some of the stitches, 6, 7 stitches, something like that. I just don't really care for the little fuzzy ends of serging that can poke out, and particularly at a neckline where you see that. So now that finishes it off really neatly. Now I'm going to show you how to top stitch it. So we'll go to the right side of the garment, and again I'm going to start at the center back, and I'm going to set it up into the sewing machine just like I did for applying the binding. And this time I want to make sure that the seam allowance is towards the garment, and you want to find a reference point on your particular presser foot so that there's something visual that you can line up with the seam allowance. And in this case, I'm on the inside of the right toe of my presser foot. I'm going to move my needle position to the left just a little bit because I find that I like to top stitch a pretty good distance from that well of that seam. And if I'm not using a walking foot, but normally I would be, and so you can see that I'm getting a little tunneling, so I'm having to shift quite a bit. That's what happens when you don't use a walking foot. But by putting the needle position down and adjusting quite a bit, I can get a nice smooth line. When I come to the really thick part of the shoulder seam, I want to make sure that I make my stitches even. So I slow it down, readjust fairly often, and I'm over that in pretty good shape. So I would continue all the way around the entire neck, overlapping the seam allowance, or excuse me, the stitching line at the center back. Now I'm going to show you the final product. So here's the neck with some top stitching that's a fairly good distance from that seam allowance, but it really lies smoothly. There are no puckers, no little blips. Looks great. After you have top stitched, then it's time to finally give it a little bit of a steam press to help mold that neck binding into shape. So you want to get your ham and place the opening of the neckline on the ham and steaming it. Again, I'm not letting the iron really touch the fabric, but I want to mold that, and I want to wait until it's cooled before I move it. I want to get all of the excess that I can out of this. I want to be sure this is smooth, get some of the little puckers out that might have occurred in the sewing, torquing I call it. So you just keep moving this around on this ham and pressing this until you're satisfied that you've got a pretty good look. So once you've done that all the way around, you're ready to move on and sew some sleeves and some side seams. As you learned in lesson 2, you've prepared your hems for your sleeves. So you can see that I'm all ready to go and sew my sleeves together. I have my fusee web on my edge with the paper still intact, and I have my memory crease that was created by my 1-inch template. So once I've prepared the hem of my sleeve, it's time to pin and sew the sleeve to the garment, matching your notches and your dot, finishing your seam as you've chosen to do so. And then we want to press this. And again, we're using our ham because it's a curve and we want to retain that curve. Make sure that you're pressing on the right side of the fabric and the seam allowance is towards the sleeve. So I just drag that across the ham a little bit. I use the woolly side of the ham so there's a little resistance. And again, I'm just steaming. I don't want that shine of that knit to come up now. You just keep readjusting this. Make sure that seam is going in the right direction. I have trouble with that a little bit over the sleeve cap because there's a fair amount of extra seam allowance, it seems like, right there. The seam allowance has been pressed towards the sleeve, and now the next step is to sew your side seams. The sleeve seam and the side seam are all sewn as one unit. Just make sure that you're matching your seams, matching your edges, and then we're going to trim out the hem and get rid of some bulk. So I like to do a little bit of trimming. I'll show you how I do that. Using my special scissors, I trim off the serging, come up just a little bit so that I'm within the amount that the hem is going to come into that. Cut that off, and then I clip both seam allowances to the seam so that when I fold this hem in place, I don't have near the bulk. And sometimes I will even come in here and get those little corners off. You know, I like for the inside of my garment to look just as good as the outside. So once I've sewn that seam, I've trimmed out the hem, now I'm ready to remove that paper covering and fuse that hem in place and top stitch in the way that you learned, whatever option you choose. The last step in constructing your Maison top is to make the hemband and to sew it onto the garment. The process is very much like what we've already done with the neck binding. The piece just happens to be wider. So you can see that I've already applied my fusee web to one long edge, and I'm going to pull this paper off. So it's easy to take off. It's just a long piece, but you can do the fusee web in sections. It doesn't have to be one long piece. And you can see this little line of glue. Again, I've left it out of the ends so that I can sew the ends. I bring the raw edges up to match, press those. Again, this helps to control the curl. It also keeps this from shifting and torquing when you apply it. So having those raw edges together is really important. Once I have fused the entire hemband, you can see I have a little bit of a torquing right there, and that's what can really change and settle down with that fusee web. Give the bottom fold just a little bit of a light steam. Don't press it too hard. And I'll do the whole thing, and then just like the neck binding, we put the hemband on the garment. We match the notches, we match the dot to the center front, and we match the seam to the right side seam of the garment. Just sew that on. There's a little bit of pulling, there's some easing of the garment into the hemband. It's not nearly as much as the neck binding, but you do need to pull that hemband a bit to match up with the raw edges of the garment. But once that is on, you sew it, you finish it, and then I'm going to show you how to press it. Once the hemband is on, it's time to give it a little bit of a press just to make sure that that seam allowance is towards the garment. So you can see that I have finished it nicely. You can see the straight stitching, and the hem allowance is towards the garment. Now, in order to keep that hem allowance towards the garment, I want to steam it just a little bit. So the best way to do that is to actually wrap the hemband around a sleeve board. Give it a little bit of stretch or tension so that flattens out the easing of the garment, and steam it. Hand press it. And I'll just do it kind of section at a time. Do one more here. You can see the easing. I'm stretching it just enough that that easing is gone. And steam it. Because you want the easing to show, but you want that seam allowance to be pressed to the garment side. Now let's take a look at the finished Maison top. I'm really happy with mine, and I hope that you are too, and I also hope you had a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining me for our very first So Confident Series 10 garment. And if you have any questions or issues along the way, I hope you'll join me in the Zoom question and answer. And next month, we're going to be making the Maison joggers. So hold on to that pattern, get your fabric ready, and we'll see you again.